Hello, class. I just wanted to talk to you about this poem, America, because there's so much I put a lot of points in the discussion board, and it's not only difficult for you probably to choose between those threads, but it's hard for me to keep up because I want to read every single comment and respond to everything. And with multiple classes doing the same thing, there's no way I can read them all. And I also want to just go over a couple of things that I usually say in class that I didn't say in the discussion board. So you have some great responses and you're very intuitive. And I love the fact that most of you noticed and were sensitive to the fact that Allen Ginsberg is not a racist, or he was not. And I wanted to ask you instead of telling you. And then, of course, if you said, well, sure, he was a racist, he said the N word, then I would be fast to say, no, that's not it. And let me tell you why. Okay, because it's not my opinion. I'm not certainly not trying to sell you Allen Ginsberg. I don't care if you're a fan or not. I'm not even sure I'm a fan, although I do find his life and story fascinating. So that doesn't matter. And no matter which political side you're on in the world, and I know people have very extreme feelings and difficult feelings right now, and strong feelings and about things like that, you should know who he is. That's why we're studying Allen Ginsberg. You should know who he is. We don't have a lot of time to spend on poetry. We don't spend enough time on poetry, I don't think, in this class, but it's not a creative writing class, so we can't really do, it's kind of a survey class where we do a little bit of a lot of things. So what I want you to know, though, is that he was considered by many, Rolling Stone, Time magazine, to have been the most important poet, not the best poet. He was certainly not the best poet of the 20th century, but the most important poet of the 20th century. That's a big title. That's a big label. Why? Not because, and some of you might say, why? All I did was smoke pot and complain and he didn't get a job. Well, you have to remember something. Okay, poems are written by poets who role play. They're not always speaking about themselves. That's so important to know. They're very often picking a persona and speaking through that persona. That's what poets do. That's what songwriters do. Go listen to John Prine's Angel from Montgomery. That songwriter who died from COVID, he's probably the best songwriter we've had, one of the best in the folk world. And he wrote a song called Angel from Montgomery. And here's a man writing a song through a woman's eyes, and an old woman's eyes. And so then a bunch of female singers covered it and made it a hit. And so my point is, it's role playing. So even though this is probably largely autobiographical on his part, he's speaking for more than just the mood he was in. He was not clinically depressed. Allen Ginsberg may have had highs and lows, but he was extremely high energy. He was a workaholic. He worked day and night. He traveled constantly. He was always on the go, always on the road, constantly writing. He was not someone to sit around and do nothing. So even though that may be the impression that this poem gives off, that's not at all the kind of life that he lived. And so with that in mind, I want to tell you about a few special parts in this poem that we didn't get to in the discussion board. And one of them is when I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and this is just my trying to show you proof that he was not a racist. And that's just one of the points that I want to talk about. And we'll look at some of the other points in this poem as well. Ginsberg was part of a movement that we didn't spend time on, but called the Beat Poets. You studied now some about the Lost Generation, and the Lost Generation was the 20s. It was a modernist movement, and it was largely made up of heavily drinking writers, and it was based mostly in Paris. The Beat Poets, another nickname given to them that they didn't care necessarily for. Okay, there's a long story with how they got their name. They were a post-war movement as well, post-World War II. And they didn't say, let's start a movement. You just get called a movement, right, after a while. And so they were post-war, they were post-modern. So after the modernists, they were mostly in America. And even though they traveled, and they experimented more with psychedelic drugs because that's what was going on. That wasn't really going on in the 1920s in Paris. Okay, they drank with a vengeance because they had no prohibition there, and they could. And so I think if those psychedelic drugs were around, I wonder maybe they would have tried them. Although they may have been a little bit, even though they had similar workaholic writer personalities, they may not have been ready for that yet. Things come when the world is ready for them. And so so the psychedelic drug movement came, and or a phenomenon, I guess you can call it, happened, and a lot of these writers wanted to see what they could do under that kind of influence. And so Ginsberg was certainly not the only one to experiment in that way, and that's where a lot of his writing came from. So they were similar movements, similar groups of writers getting together, trying to create something new. That's really what it's about, just trying to make it new, make it better. Now, Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, another very famous character or person who wrote a book called On the Road. It was the main novel, the main book from the Beat Generation, which they were, again, nicknamed, about just taking off and hitchhiking across the country and just seeing where the world took you. And so that they were good friends. They used to hang around in places like Harlem and San Francisco because that's where the action was if you were a writer or an artist. And in Harlem, they would go and see the jazz musicians. And a lot of the jazz musicians in Harlem at the time, and I hope you don't mind me saying black and white, although I have major issues with colors and that there's, it's hard to call somebody black and somebody white, but those are the names we use. So, and I say major issues because I'm thinking about Malcolm X's description of color in the Malcolm X Spike Lee movie when they talk about how the white historians put together the dictionary and said that black meant dirty and dark and evil and wicked and secretive and dishonest and horrible, and white meant pure and innocent and beautiful and sacred and all this. It's just, and so nonsense. And so I have issues with black and white, but for our purposes, I'll say black and white. And so, pardon me, the musicians were mostly black in the Harlem area at the time because they were famous jazz clubs, and the Harlem Renaissance was not that long ago. And they just thought it was the coolest place. A lot of white people hung around there because they appreciated the art in Harlem, and they knew they couldn't find that kind of excitement for the arts in very many other places. So they would go to the jazz clubs, and they would see these famous horn players, take your pick who, playing these parts where their music was how they could speak out against whatever injustices they were dealing with at the time. And, take your pick there too, right? What kind of oppression or racism or discrimination were they going through? And so these black horn guys, and this is going back to even like Charlie Parker and similar horn people. They took this at Dizzy Gillespie and others, that they would perform in ways that they gave their all. It was like saying, I am somebody and I'm going to be something and I'm going to be successful and I'm going to make crowds happen and I'm going to leave something in this world when I go. And so they just loved that because don't forget, Allen Ginsberg was a minority too. He was gay. He was Jewish. He was an artist. He was poor a lot of the time. So he felt like a minority as well, even though you might just look at him and see a white guy. But he could identify with that. And so he did not follow the mainstream and found himself then also feeling somewhat marginalized. And for that reason, he wanted to pay tribute to these black musicians that he liked so much. They would hold these long notes until they couldn't hold their breath anymore. And that's why he does this. America, when I was 7, Mama took me to communist cell meetings. They sold us garbanzos, a handful per ticket. A ticket cost a nickel and the speeches were free. Everybody was angelic and sentimental about the workers. It was all so sincere. You have no idea what a good thing the party was. In 1835, Scott Nearing was a grand old man, a real mensch. Mother Bloor, and he goes on from there. He doesn't take a breath until mensch there. Okay? He says, Mother Bloor made me cry. This is the Poetry Foundation version. And by the way, this phrase here isn't in the copy that you have. So a couple of these lines in this one are actually from different versions that he had come up with over the years. Sometimes the publisher didn't want to say certain lines. And so, he does that not just to be weird and a bad poet, but to pay tribute. He wanted to, like in jazz songs, you quote somebody else that you like, the way in 80s music we started, and I say we because I was doing it too, we started sampling music. You would take a clip of something you like, think of Under Pressure. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. Forgive me. I was at my daughter's tonight, and she has a cat. And I'm so allergic to cats. I don't want to edit the tape. It'll take, or the tape. See, 80s. The video, it will take too long. I still have cat air in me, I guess. Anyway, but when you sample music, you take a clip of something, right? And then you use it in your piece. So that was his way of paying tribute. Is the same thing here, is just taking this long lines and not taking a breath and holding it the way they did. So that was his way of paying tribute to those Black musicians. He was not a racist. Okay, this part down here. Yes, he says the N-word, but did you hear how he said it? It's so important to interpret this the right way. Right? He's making fun of people who make fun of other people. So let me show you this. America, you don't really want to go to war. And now he starts mocking America. It's them bad Russians and them Chinamen and them Russians. In other words, we blame everything on everybody else. We were so afraid. Don't forget, he had a parent that was from Russia. Right. So he didn't really appreciate the fact that we were just so threatened by everyone else. The Russia wants to eat us alive. The Russia's power mad. She wants to take our cars from our garages. Her wants to grab Chicago. Right. He's mocking people who are so afraid. Now, granted, we had a Cold War going on at the time. But her now he starts imitating the way we talk about Native Americans, the way we treated Native Americans. Right, we called them. Well, you know what would happen in this country, and so her wants to grab Chicago. He's kind of showing her needs. He's speaking that improper Native American because that's how Americans mock Native Americans, right? Her needs are Reader's Digest. Her wants are auto plants in Siberia. Him big bureaucracy running our filling stations. He's mocking the things that he thinks the country is at fault for. That no good. Ugh, him make Indians learn read. Him need big black niggers. He goes, right? Her make us all work 16 hours a day. Help. In other words, those are the things that people are just silly about, he thought. America, now see, this is what you should have noticed if you said, oh, he's a racist. He said the N-word. No. This is where you got to read it closely, right? America, this is quite serious, he's saying. America, this is the impression I get from looking in the television set. America, is this correct? Is this who we are? Right? And then it gets back down to his, sarcasm there. No racist says, America, I am the Scottsboro Boys. If you don't know who the Scottsboro Boys, go look it up. One of your assignments is you have a choice. You can, this coming week, you can, and this is the semester fall 2020. We're a few days before the election. And so if I happen to use this video in a future class, today is November 1st, 2020. So you may have a different assignment. But usually I use the same assignment. It may or may not be this week. It may be another week. But for the group that I'm doing this for now, you will have between the 1st and 8th of November, your assignment is to either rewrite America with more modern references. So, you might use different historical or current events here. Okay. Or you can take 5 or 7 of these references that he mentions and look them up and tell me what they are. Who is he talking about there? So if you like to do research more than creative writing, you could choose that option. Okay. Who's Mother Bloor? So on. And the Scottsboro Boys. Okay. If you say, I am the Scottsboro Boys, you're speaking for poorly treated Black folks who were Black boys who suffered major trauma there unfairly. Classic right? American stuff there. So I don't want to say what happened there, but a similar situation to somebody like Emmett Till, who was beaten to death for whistling at a white woman. Okay. Okay. And so, no, he was not a racist. Now, this line here, what is a strophe? He says, America, I'll sell you Oh, here, hold on, back up a little. America, how can I write a holy litany in your silly mood? Again, a lot of this is just funny. It's supposed to be funny. You have to have a sense of humor. Okay. You may not think it's funny, but that's, maybe you don't have that kind of humor. So that's fine. I will continue. He says, like Henry Ford, my strophes. A strophe is a line of poetry. What he's saying is he's not worth anything. $2.27, January 17th, 1956. I've given you all and I have nothing. In other words, I'm not worth anything. But Henry Ford, capitalism, someone who can sell cars, they're worth everything. So he says, my strophes are my lines of poetry are as individual as his automobiles. More so, they're all different sexes. And he starts getting funny there. America, I will sell you strophes, 2,500 a piece, 500 down on your old strophe. Selling his lines of poetry like he wishes he could, the same way cars are sold. It's a mockery of capitalism and how maybe we don't care about the arts. We only care about, making money and things like that. Okay. And don't forget this line about being president despite the fact that I'm a Catholic. There was no JFK yet who was a Catholic and did make it to the presidency. Again, he's just making, he's being just loaded with sarcasm here. Okay. I also want to talk about this everybody's serious but me part. I think I said this in the discussion. Some of you may have seen it. And it's funny that he talks about being obsessed with Time magazine because they would later say how important he was, that he was the most important poet of the century. And so he says, it's always telling me about responsibility. Businessmen are serious. That's the rich, right? Movie producers are serious. And again, symbolizing in general, not all businessmen are rich. I know you can't take everything too literally, right? Too generally. But the businessmen, the big, powerful, rich people are serious. Movie producers, famous people are serious. Everybody's serious but me. Me, not just literally meaning him. Again, right? He's talking about a larger group of people. We call them now the 99%. The rest of us. Right? The ordinary folk, right? It occurs to me that I am America. I'm talking to myself again, right? And so that rings true today. And I always say, what part of this seems timeless to you? Like it could have been written yesterday. How about this line? Asia is rising against me. I haven't got a Chinaman's chance. What's the next great superpower in this world? Right? Is it still China? Yeah. Right? Some people would argue. But has that changed much? No. So all this makes it, the complex work that it is. Okay. A lot of these are specific references to some of his friends. Burroughs is in Tangiers. I don't think he'll come back. It's sinister. That's one of his friends, who left the country and so on. So, each line says something that might make you feel, questionable. That's curious. Of course, he doesn't literally mean take off your clothes. He spent a lot of time in India, though, watching people dying in the streets of starvation. He didn't like that. So when will we help India? Right? When can I go in the supermarket and buy what I need with my good looks? Of course he doesn't mean that. Some people say, oh, he just wants a free ride. Those liberals, they just want free money. No, he's it's a joke, and it's sarcasm, and it's just it's a frustration about capitalism, and that's just something, your machinery is too much for me. Just how big and powerful and, the world feels and how little the little guy can feel sometimes, that's just something that we all kind of go through, at times. Okay. So this is mainly what I wanted to say. I won't make this much longer, but I think, I got to the main parts that I wanted to say, but just do keep in mind again that, this is a man who spent his whole life trying to speak out for injustices. Okay. And they weren't just racist. I mean, he was a lot of different kinds of poets. He was a performance poet. He was a gay poet. He was a political poet. He was an environmental poet. he wrote ecological poetry. I mean, he was varied, and he was interested, and he worked very hard to speak for the underprivileged. Okay, so just a few thoughts to get you to think a little bit more about this poem and Allen Ginsberg. I hope that if you hear his name, you'll continue to study him. You can also find it's not on Netflix anymore, but somewhere you'll be able to find James Franco plays Allen Ginsberg in a movie called Howl. Um, Ginsberg wrote this very famous book of poetry, which America appears in. This book was published in 1956, and James Franco played him in a movie where they discussed him writing these poems, and he plays Ginsberg. He doesn't just talk about him; he plays him. And this book went to trial because some people tried to say, because of all his sexual references, he was very flamboyantly gay and sexual. And he says they tried to say that this wasn't of any merit, and that the Beat Generation writers didn't really write anything with any merit. They were just the only rebellion around. They were the only, loudmouths around. They weren't really writing anything important. And a lot of people felt that way. You could decide. You'd have to read On the Road by Jack Kerouac yourself. You could decide, or get this little book. It's everywhere. And you decide. But the courts then had to decide, did it have literary merit? So it says on the back of the book, Allen Ginsberg, his Howl, which was the poem that made him famous. It's a lot longer than America, so we don't use that one. And Other Poems was originally published by City Lights Bookstore in the fall of 1956 by his friend Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who I believe is still alive. He's 1,000 years old. And the bookstore is still there if they survived the pandemic. Subsequently seized by U.S. Customs and the San Francisco police, this book was a subject of a long court trial at which a series of poets and professors persuaded the court that the book was not obscene. They wanted to make it, in other words, a banned book. And they said, it's got some literary merit and value to it, so it's part of that. So if you like James Franco, you can go watch him in that film. All right, folks, I've been blabbing, but I hope that you found it helpful, and I hope that the poem gets you at least thinking about some of the poetry that was being kind of earth-shattering and presented in the middle of the last century, the 20th century, which was a pretty amazing time. Okay, and see you soon.